Hello. In this recording I'll be providing a demonstration of the initial setup dialog that's performed with the new install of any ISE node. And that would be true of a node that's appliance or VM based, and then of course true of a brand new deployment or a node that's going to be integrated into an existing ISE deployment. Ultimately, the setup dialog, a required step, setting up network access information on the node's G0 interface. The G0 interface and its IP are used as the node's management interface, ultimately required for inter-node communication in a larger deployment. That's regardless of which other interfaces may be ultimately active on this node later on. And then of course on the node that's representing the PAN or policy administration node, this will be the IP address that we'll use for GUI based management. Okay, as we're looking here, we see the setup dialog. Of course, this is viewable only by virtue of being able to access the node's console interface, whether that's serial console or the VM-based console. And of course, the node is aware that no installation has been performed at this point, so it's prompting us to type setup to configure the appliance. Not clear they want us to use setup as the login name, so we'll start that process. Okay, first step is to enter the host name or the node name. This will be ultimately applied as an FQDN with the completed script. Then the IP address we'll use for management within our lab environment. Notice that we can enter the Control-C to start the script over again in the event of a typo. Also notice the support for IPv6, which we'll not be demonstrating in this lab environment. The DNS server that we're utilizing here is also our Active Directory domain controller. And then a quick note about time sync. Yeah, pretty important within anticipation of a larger deployment, and certainly anticipation of integration with Active Directory. Time sync, pretty important. So in this case, our lab NTP server is also our domain controller. And then a quick note about time zones. Default time zone, of course, is UTC or GMT. Generally recommended that this is the time zone utilized in anticipation of a larger deployment, and then basic consistent reference across the board reports and whatnot can always be ran based on your local time zone. And then of course for this node that we'll want to activate SSH, that would be a discussion that you wouldn't want to have based on where the node is ultimately going to be deployed and what management is required. A node that will ultimately be acting as a PSN or policy service node only may not need SSH type access. This node of course will be our PAN and multi-persona node, so we want SSH here. And then the username that we're creating, admin, is the default name. Ultimately, through this setup dialog, two representations of admin will be created, one for the command line and one for the GUI. Operates very similarly to some of Cisco's other products, like Cisco Call Manager, for example. There's a CLI user and a GUI-based user that have the same name, so we're creating that here. Okay, we're seeing the first steps of the setup dialog performed, doing a quick test of the network interface, do some other verifications to verify that it can reach the gateway. Ultimately, this setup dialog, as it's running through initializing the install for ISE, including database, setup and installation, initialization, ultimately the overall setup process, which we won't record the entirety of here, takes about 40-45 minutes approximately to accomplish the entire setup and before we can begin GUI based management.